Read the order of the day.
Government business order of the day, standing in the name of Mrs Finocchiaro, the 50th anniversary of Cyclone Tracy, resumption of debate on the question that the motion be agreed to.
Member for Goyder, you have 19 minutes remaining on your contribution. You didn't get far this morning, did you? Please continue.
Madam Speaker, I'll continue. I was recently fortunate enough to meet a lovely member of my community named Shelley. Shelley is a Cyclone Tracy survivor. We spoke about her experiences surviving the storm, and she told me about a letter that her mother, a Mrs Joan Ellen Thomas, wrote many years ago recounting her and her family's ordeal. To my understanding, Mrs Joan Thomas is no longer with us, but her words live on through her letters, thanks to her trusty typewriter and through her surviving children and family. I'll read a few excerpts from this letter, which can be found on Territory Stories under the title The Terror of Cyclone Tracy. Madam Speaker, the letter highlights and begins by giving an example of just how unaware of the seriousness of the storm many at the time were. The letter begins, "We'd been getting warnings from midday on Xmas Eve every half hour, along with instructions on what to do when and if the cyclone struck. We were a little blasés about the whole bit, as we'd had so many come close and veer away as they reached the coast. In fact, Cyclone Selma came close a fortnight before. I'd been at work until 2 p.m, and on my way home, I remember thinking I'd get home and close the door and not go out again. There was an ominous look about the sky, and it was blowing and raining quite a bit then. I waited at home, preparing for the big day on the morrow. We were expecting 17 for Xmas dinner, which we were to have, as usual, spread out on the floor with the lounge cushions around it. As each one of my family members came home, I breathed a sigh of relief as the reports were getting more serious by the hour. Pete, who I believe to be her son, decided to go out to his mate's place after dinner, as after all, it was Christmas Eve. I didn't like that one bit, however, he's his own man. About 8 p.m, Ron, her husband, suggested I cook the poultry as the lights were the first thing to go in any weather in Darwin. So I set out about and did my Christmas cooking. I finished mopping the floors about 10 and everything was perfect for the big day. Meanwhile, Tracy was steadily marching down the coast and the warnings were getting more alarming. Madam Speaker, the letter continues and explains that the family tidied up the house, took down the wall ornaments and anything they thought could become a flying missile, and her husband, Ron, lashed down furniture and put away anything he could and moved his car to a safer spot. At around 11 p.m. that evening, Miss Thomas continues her story with, "Then the lights went out. I suggested to Shell that she and I try to get a bit of sleep, and we made up the night and day division and tried to settle down. Ron tried to read at the table with the pressure lamp, but the wind was getting so strong that with every gust the room shook and we all startled up. We were terribly worried about Pete and wished he were home. About 11:30 we heard his car come in and we settled down on listening to the news reports. Pete said, 'Well, there's only one thing to do now, and that's get stuck into the brandy.' I wasn't too keen on that idea. I reckon we needed to keep our wits about us. However, with the next gust of wind, I was the first one to reach for a glass." Madam Speaker, the letter later continues as the storm continued to belt down. "The water was beating in under the locked louvres and already spreading across the floor. So I called the men and we moved all the beds and furniture back. Pete got the broom and swept the water into the bathroom drain. It was soon obvious that it wasn't going to be quick enough, so he elected to go downstairs for a brace and a bit to drill a hole in the floor of the hall. He couldn't get the front door open against the wind, so he had to go out the back way. I was frantic till he got back. Ron was worried about drilling a hole in the government house and removed the doorstop so he could put it back later. Little did he know that we wouldn't have a house left to worry about. The water by this time was ankle deep and Pete shone the torch into his room. The rain was coming in so fast it was as though it was raining inside. So we decided to abandon the effort and retired to the brandy bottle. It was well after midnight by this time, so we decided to open our Christmas presents. We had great fun for half an hour. Pete had bought me a clothes dryer. I never even got to plug it in. The news came through that the cyclone was almost upon us and the house was shuddering from each blow of the wind, and then the radio stations went off the air. We knew it was almost upon us and that we were really in for it. Madam Speaker, the letter details as the family moves into the bathroom as the store rages on and then continues. The whole house was moving, and the wind was tearing the trees to shreds outside. The noise was terrible. Ron wanted to grab a few valuables, but I told him, "Come on, it doesn't matter. It's only money. It's only money, as long as we're all right. I don't give about anything." It was fairly crowded in there, referring to the bathroom, standing room only, so Pete got a chair and sat outside in the hallway. Next minute, the whole wall of louvs opposite us exploded inwards and Pete was showered with glass. There is no sound in all the world like smashing louvs. It's like 100 iron pipes dropped onto a concrete from a height. I said to Pete, "Get in here and lock that door," but he realised what it was going to be like later and decided we will all need a pair of shoes. So he found us a pair each from his wardrobe. Very glamorous, Shell and I looked. By now, the wind was a roaring, screaming shriek, and we could not speak without yelling to be heard. The men had to lean the combined weight against the door to keep it closed, and they were both built like Sherman tanks until they remembered the slide bolt. After that, we could take turns sitting on the edge of the bath. After about half an hour, Ron said, "There it goes," and with a tearing, wrenching shudder, the roof parted company with the walls. The bathroom rocked like a small boat on the giant sea, and we realised that the rest of the house was being torn apart piece by piece, intersped with the crash of breaking glass, banging and thumping of falling timber. It kept up for hours. We didn't think it could get any worse, but it continued to. The wind changed direction and came from the back. We felt the force of it against the exposed bathroom wall. We heard the hall wall go, and then the toilet roof next to us, peeled back like a banana skin and hammered warily over our heads. We had to take the light out of the hand basin because Shelley was seasick and the water in the bath kept rising up and wetting our backsides. The water was now totally unfit to use as the dirt pouring down the walls made it black. The water was pouring under the door like a river and Shell was getting soaked as it poured down through the light fitting. Later on, the letter continues that it got to be about 4 a.m. and we were waiting for the eye so that we could get to safety. However, the eye never passed over them. Madam Speaker, the family continued to remain in the bathroom while they were waiting for the break that never came, until eventually her husband Ron continued that there's nothing between us and that but this flimsy wall, and I think we'll have to ride it to the ground. The wall was heaving with each gust like a giant breathing. I looked at Pete and he raised his absolute eyebrows. He was absolutely like the Rock of Gibraltar. I didn't know what we would have done without him. It was about then that my prayer changed from "keep my family safe" to "please God, keep us together" over and over again. I thought of nothing else. At about 5 a.m, we realised that we weren't going to get a break, and I said to Ron that we've got to get out. If only we could get into the cars, I reckon we'd be all right. Ron said, "No way, we'd be killed by flying debris." My heart sank before... flying debris, sorry. Pete said, "Look, I think the wind is lessening. Let's wait for the in-between gusts and I'll make a break for it." I was very much against it, but he was very determined, and so they waited. He took a torch and dashed out. We slammed the door behind him and we waited for 15 minutes. I could feel myself starting to crack. It seemed like hours until we heard him hammer on the door with a broom handle. We thought it was the signal to go, and in the next lull, Ron picked up the lamp and we dashed out, hanging on to one each other to keep from being blown apart. Shell said later, "Mum, you had 5 arms that night." We bent low and fought our way along the floor to the back steps. We almost blew over the edge when the wind caught us full force, but there at the bottom of the steps was Pete, showing us the way with his torch. We had to clamber over the top rail and drop down into the garden as the iron and debris covered the staircase. We crept alongside the boat and fell shivering and gasping into Pete's car, where he'd already found dry blankets and towels from God knows where, and fell into an exhausted sleep for an hour. After huddling in Pete's car, the family had made it through the night. The letter continues the next morning. We woke at daybreak to our neighbours tapping on the window. We opened our eyes to complete and utter destruction. We could not believe our eyes. It was still raining and very cold, and we were all starving. Ron managed to clamber back into the remains of the house and got our chickens out of the fridge, and with that and a carton of cold milk, we sat in the car and ate our Christmas breakfast. The brick flats opposite hadn't fared too badly, and the people called over to us for a hot coffee. We made raincoats out of garbage bags and went back to survey the wreckage. From our flat deck, we could see for miles where once we couldn't see past the trees. And everywhere, as far as the eye could see, it looked the same. Total disaster. Even looking at it, we could not believe it was possible. There should have been thousands killed, and who knows how many are still buried under the rubble. Where our bedrooms had been, the floor was swept clean, not a stick remained. Madam Speaker, later in this letter, Ms Thomas explains that amongst all the chaos, there were some lighter moments. I continue. There were a few lighter moments throughout amongst the nightmare, like Shelley's pet mouse that spent the entire night in her shirt pocket. I would have had a fit had I known. And the budgie, shaken but unhurt, chirping loudly behind a kitchen cupboard, and when we put him out on the lawn to dry out, he called all of the escape-coloured birds from miles around. It was lovely to see them unhurt, and they came down and fell out of our hands. The family then moved into the tax office with 2 other families and 2 men, although it was extensively damaged for a few nights. They gave them a dry place to sleep, they had a gas camping cooker to cook on, and plenty of food, as luckily everyone had stocked up for the wet. The family then headed south on the 29th, and Shelley and her mother would later return on the 10th of February 1975. In Mrs Thompson's words, the first thought she had when they were leaving Darwin was, "Yes, we'll be back." Ron had already applied for and got a job with the Northern Territory Department. We didn't know what would happen, but all we were sure is that we'd return and build again. Darwin does that to you. Madam Speaker, I would like to pay tribute to Mrs Joan Ellen Thomas, her family, and especially Shelley for bringing this letter and the story within to my attention. I thank all those in the chamber who have contributed on this important milestone and pay my respects to the survivors both in and out of this chamber, the families of the 66 people who tragically lost their lives that Christmas Eve, and commend those who have helped rebuild the Territory after the devastation of Tracy. I commend this motion to the Assembly.
Member for Port Darwin.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of the motion and to recount that as someone who did not live in the Territory at the time, nonetheless, Cyclone Tracy had quite an impact on myself and my family. My cousin Annie and her family were living in Darwin when Cyclone Tracy struck, and as a young kid, I was on Christmas holidays with my parents, my sisters, my grandparents and my auntie, who was Annie's mum. I remember waking up on Christmas Day to everybody looking so concerned and devastated and worried, and it was confusing as a young child to understand what was happening because this was Christmas Day. Everything was supposed to be positive and wonderful and happy. And then I learned from my auntie what had happened in Darwin and that nobody knew what had happened to Annie. It was some 48 hours before we received any advice that Annie and her family had survived in what was the concrete structure, the laundry, on the bottom of their old Territory-style house, and that structure was all that remained of the property that they had sheltered in. When I moved to Darwin some 30 years ago and met a lot of the people who had been around when Cyclone Tracy struck, I was struck by the resilient nature of these people and how, even though they had gone through such devastation, their total passion and commitment to the Territory remained strong. My very first job here in the Territory was working as the Executive Director of the Australian Medical Association Northern Territory, and it was during that time that I came to know and love a number of the clinicians who worked in the old Darwin Hospital and who rallied to support the community in the devastation that followed Cyclone Tracy. And I thought it would just be worth mentioning some of those people who had such a profound impact on those left standing after the cyclone destroyed their hometown. So Dr. Ella Stack, who was a GP, who continued to work tirelessly after the cyclone, looking after patients, who then went on to become the Mayor of Darwin, a place she described as a pile of rubble she inherited, but that she was thrilled to be part of rebuilding. I had the privilege of knowing and working with people such as Dr. Alan Bromwich, who had moved to Darwin in the 1950s and led the surgical team at Darwin Hospital, and after the cyclone hit, led the surgical response. He was joined by clinicians Mr. Aaron Mahajani, also a surgeon, and his wife, Dr. Zahara Mahajani, who was a GP, who actually worked and set up a clinic in the grounds of the old Berrima Primary School, providing care to people post-cyclone. Dr. Doug Mounsey, Dr. Alan Walker, all names well known to Territorians, but people who perhaps were not well known for the response that they undertook post-Cyclone Tracy. Another well-known Territorian, John Hardy, many people may not know, actually came to the Territory as a radiographer. And post-Cyclone Tracy was one of the very many Allied Health Service professionals who stayed on and battled and supported the population post the disaster. And I'd like to make special mention of somebody who is most often not remembered in the health response, probably because for many people his job was too confronting. But Dr. Jurgen Rhodes was the only pathologist living and working in Darwin during that time, and he was tasked with caring for those we lost during the cyclone. And he refused, after he was instructed to create a mass grave, to do that. He fought for those people and made sure that when their loved ones returned to Darwin, they would know where they were buried, and that they could mourn them appropriately. So every single person that we lost who was recovered received a funeral and an independent grave, so that when their families returned to Darwin, they knew that they had been cared for. He was quoted as saying, "Everyone gets a marked grave and everyone gets a funeral." And in that environment where people were concerned about post-cyclone disease, post-cyclone trauma, that a man would stand up and for those that we lost is quite remarkable. So to all of the healthcare professionals who were here during Cyclone Tracy, many of whom are still with us today, thank you. Thank you for standing by. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for being there.
Thank you. Member for Port Down. Member for Blain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to commemorate 50 years since Darwin was put through the forging disaster that was Cyclone Tracy. I was thinking today that Darwin is a place of a tough place that's that has tough people. We've been through at least 2 rounds on the anvil. The first when we were bombed during World War II, and the second when Darwin was largely decimated by Cyclone Tracy. I'd like to thank the member for Nelson for his heartfelt contribution this morning. We were all deeply moved by the personal impact of Tracy on your family. Unfortunately, the city of Palmerston and the seat of Blain didn't exist when Tracy struck back in Christmas Eve 1974, as development started building Palmerston in 1980. But as a born and bred Territorian, which I'm very proud of, there's many things that I can bring to this house. To start with, I'd like to mention a monument at my senior college. So I went to Casuarina Senior College, yes, in the northern suburbs. There's a monument at the front which I walked past every day, every school day for 2 years, until it just became part of sort of the air that we breathe. It's a memorial that's constructed with twisted girders from the home of Sergeant Kevin Malley, which was destroyed in the cyclone in 1974, and it commemorates those who died in Cyclone Tracy. At the height of the cyclone, the Malley home totally disintegrated, blowing Sergeant Malley and his 2 children, who were in his arms, 15 metres to the ground. His wife Joyce fell beside him. He threw himself over his children to protect them, receiving severe injuries which required over 200 stitches from flying debris. Joyce had a broken spine and Fiona severe leg injuries which required 23 operations to correct. Only their son Stephen escaped unscathed. The family was first evacuated by aircraft to Sydney. The girders were bent by front-end loaders during the clean-up operations. A teacher from Casuarina High School took the initiative to use the twisted girders as a monument. The girders were set in concrete and the memorial was unveiled by the administrator in June 84. That is a monument to Cyclone Tracy. Huge steel girders twisted and bent by the power of the cyclone and the subsequent clean-up. And I would recommend the Mayor of Darwin visit that monument and take inspiration from it. But I move on. My main contribution today is I'd like to tell a story of two Tracys, two very, very different perspectives on the same traumatic event. One from my mother, who was with I wasn't born at the time, I'm an 81 baby, but my mother, my father, my brother and my sister were at the farm outside Bachelor when Tracy hit, and the other from a dear friend of mine, Tanya. So she's given me permission to share her story, and I'll come to that in a moment. So Mum and Dad were on the farm Christmas Eve, 1974. My brother Errol was 6. My sister Marjorie was 4. So it was a Christmas Eve as usual. We had a pine forest of cypress pines. My dad had gone down, found a smaller tree, cut it down, brought it up to the house, set it in a basin of water, and they had the presents under there. My mum tells me they woke up the next morning and it was a bit of they knew that the cyclone was in the area, but it wasn't forecast to hit Darwin, so they weren't particularly concerned. And they were about 70 kilometres from the coast. Mum said that she was woken up at about 5 a.m. in the morning when the louvers were rattling, which was quite odd. She went back to bed, got up a little bit later, and went to turn on the radio, as they usually do, and there was no radio, which was quite odd. Now, they had some chickens, so I will come to the link between my story. Is that working? Yeah, that's better. So that morning, the family all got into the car and then went into Bachelor to take eggs around and do the regular egg run. When they went into Bachelor, the people that they met told them the horrific news that Darwin had been blown away in Cyclone Tracy. Dad had lots of friends up in Darwin, so straight away they turned the car around and headed up to Darwin so he could go and check on his friends. Mum was telling me that as they headed into town, she clearly remembers all the leaves being stripped off the trees. She remembers now, I'm not sure if this is true or not, but my mum told me, so I'm just going to relay it here. She remembers going to the Cyreni's chook farm at Ingham's. They had a lot of chickens in cages at the time, and my mum tells me that all their feathers were blown off. So there was a large number of naked chickens sitting in the cages after the cyclone. She said there was a big wreck everywhere, all the power lines were on the ground. They did what they could and then headed back to Bachelor. Luckily, being down at the farm, they didn't have to evacuate. So the farm ran off its own diesel generator, and Bachelor was powered from the power station at the Rum Jungle mine at the time. They weren't part of the NT grid. Mum remembers going to Darwin to get groceries or rations, as they were at the time, for free. You didn't have to pay, you just lined up and you were issued canned food, powdered milk. They had very little fresh fruit and veggies, but being on the farm, they had lots of chickens, they had lots of eggs. They could go out into the bush, get a killer, which is feral cattle, buffaloes, horses. So they had plenty of meat, plenty to live on. So the story on the farm at Bachelor was not one of hardship, unlike Tanya's story. So my friend Tanya, who I've worked with in the IT industry, and if you're watching, Tanya, thank you for letting me share your story. So Tanya was 10 years old on Christmas Eve 1974. The family knew it was coming, but at the time it was expected to track down the coast. No one expected Tracy to take that sharp turn in towards Darwin. They lived in an elevated house in Nightcliff at the time, which will become relevant later. On that fateful Christmas Eve, Tanya remembers her mum getting ready for dinner. And in the evening, they saw the storm as it was rolling in. So her dad was concerned, and he had a plan. So her parents attended the Mormon church. Their plan A was, if the cyclone kept its track and missed Darwin, was to stay at home and ride it out in their house. Plan B was to go to the Mormon church, which was made of Besser blocks and likely to weather the cyclone. But Tracy turned and came on a direct course for Darwin. As it intensified through the evening, they heard sheets of tin tearing off the roof. The rain started to pour through the louvers. As the evening progressed and they took shelter in the bathroom, the back wall collapsed on their elevated house in Nightcliff. At some point in the night, as it became clear that things were bad and getting worse, her dad got the family together and got them to open their presents during the storm because he wasn't sure that they would get a chance to open them the next day. Tanya remembers that her parents were very scared, which must have been pretty upsetting for a young child when dad is usually the rock of the family. I remember she told me that the eye came over, so it went from the most intense part of the storm to deathly silence. The power was all out, but they could still see from all the lightning. Everything went quiet, and her dad went for a walk. He tried to get the car out so they could go to the Mormon church, but it was blocked by rubble, so plan B was out. The family went next door to the neighbour's house, the Frasers, as their house looked like it was in better condition and a better place to shelter the remainder of the storm. After the wall came back, they hid in the bathroom of the neighbour's house with the other family, and the walls started to cave in. Tanya told me that they had their hands on the walls, trying to hold them out so they didn't cave in on them. Truly terrifying. The roar of the cyclone was so loud, like a freight train that just went on, never stopping. As the wind howled, Tanya remembers her mum lying in the bath with Tanya's brother, underneath her in the bottom of the bath, and mum on top, trying to protect him with her body. And Tanya was hiding in the shower cabinet. The parents were putting their bodies on the line to protect their children. As the wind howled, the whole house was shaking, the walls were moving, and her mum got hit by a bathroom cabinet as it fell off the wall. When her dad came back in, the most horrifying thing happened. The ceiling was sucked off the house. So the sheets of iron had been coming off throughout, and then finally the structure gave out and the entire roof, including the ceiling, was sucked off and blown away. After that, the entire house on top of the stilts blew away. The whole family, the two families, were blown off the platform. Luckily, they didn't break any bones. We don't know how far they blew in the wind until they hit the ground and stopped rolling. 4 adults, 2 sets of parents, made a human chain, and they grabbed the 5 children, and they got everyone together into the Ford sedan that was under the house. And that's where they sheltered. They had to keep their heads down below window height in case something came flying and smashed through the windows of the car. They had to stay there for at least 3 hours, and Tanya says that's the longest night of her life. Tanya had landed on roofing nails. Her brother had landed on corrugated iron and sliced his leg. That wound went septic and was the reason they were airlifted out 3 days later. The next day, as the rubble cleared, her dad found the Christmas presents and put them in the storeroom under the house. But unfortunately, they were stolen by looters. And that reminded me of on the weekend when we had the 50th anniversary here in this very chamber, the member for Nightcliff, Dawn Laurie, told her story of New South Wales police walking around with guns in the aftermath of Tracy. And at the time I thought, why would they be doing that? That's just so bizarre. And this is the reason, because in the aftermath of Tracy, there was a lot of looting going on. Thank God Tanya's family and her neighbours survived Tracy with their lives intact, with only scratches and bruises from being blown off the house and landing on nails and broken glass. Thank you, Chief Minister, for bringing this motion, and thank you to all the survivors of Tracy who are still alive today to share their stories. Thank you, Tanya, for sharing your story with me, and I commend this motion to the House.
Thank you, Member for Blain. Any other speakers? Chief Minister to close.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank all of the members of Parliament who stood up and spoke today, either sharing their stories, sharing the stories of their community or loved ones, or just reflecting on the significant, indelible impact that Cyclone Tracy has had on the Northern Territory and on our culture as a people. We saw very clearly the rawness of the stories, and that rawness will never disappear. It never dissipates. 50 years on, it's still, for some, like it was yesterday. And I think that's what's very important about this particular period of time for us as we move into those 50th anniversary commemorations, is that not all survivors want to commemorate. Not all survivors want to participate. It means different things to everyone. And there is enough space in the Territory for everyone's anniversary of this gut-wrenching, tragic event to be what they need it to be. So while others are really looking forward to some of the services and other memorials and monuments that are taking place, others are not. And what we've saw here today is really the breadth of experience that people have suffered and continue to suffer through. What we also saw, though, was great stories of survival and triumph, and stories of people who've helped so profoundly, whether it was the Warrabri out near Tennant Creek, or the people in Alice Springs and Tennant Creek and Catherine who supported travellers as they were evacuating, literally with the clothes on their back, down the highway to try and find a friend or a family member interstate that they could live with for the foreseeable future. You just can't imagine putting yourself in that situation. 36,000 Territorians left Darwin in a matter of days. Even just try and picture doing that today in a modern world. It seems unachievable, and yet it was done at that time. There were no mobile phones. You can only imagine the torture of the lack of connectivity for loved ones who didn't know whether their family member or friend was safe, whether they were injured, whether they'd been killed, whether they were evacuated, where they went. I mean, remember we had planes travelling all over the country, people driving out of the Territory left and centre and right. It's a very hard thing to try and put yourself back in those shoes if you weren't there at the time. And I think for all of us, we all have those images in our mind that we've seen over our lifetime of Cyclone Tracy. For me, particularly, the photos of the women and children, and there's one photo of women and children lined up on the tarmac as they get onto a plane, and there's a young child carrying the teddy bear sort of by the arm. And so it continues to shape who we are as a people and our future moving forward. The testament really goes to the people who returned, and I know the member for Brennan talked about how her family returned just within a matter of months. Of course, there's those who stayed, but that determination to see Darwin rebuilt, when I'm sure plenty of people thought, well, that's done, move on to the next thing. The spirit was strong and people saw a future for the Territory and a future for Darwin. And we get to be the beneficiaries of that vision, that strength and courage and determination today. The speed in which Darwin rebuilt really is an incredible story. And I talked about it's hard to imagine now evacuating 36,000 people. It's hard to imagine now rebuilding the Territory in 3 short years like was done 50 years ago. It's an incredible story, an incredible triumph, an incredible feat, an unprecedented story of resilience. And I've said this before, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'll say it again. The Territory and Territorians have been forged in the fire of disaster. That is what the Territory can-do spirit is. That is where it was born. And it can never be extinguished, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Chief Minister. The question is the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. Aye. I think the ayes have it.